what are some of the, if you will, recipes that the international community has used over the last 2 or 3 decades in building peace?
I think first of all one has to appreciate that there is a donor conference quite often at the conclusion or stalemate in a conflict, and the donors determine through conditionalities what sort of political economy will develop in a post-conflict country. One of the problems is that a lot of this aid money is promised but doesn't arrive for some period. There is also an attempt to have budgetary control. That is one of the primary purposes of economic reconstruction, because governments don't necessarily have much income. The whole economy may be fragmented. There may be a large sector that is informal. In other words, it's not audited by a government. There may be a reduction. There's likely to be a reduction in revenues for the government. And yet there are all kinds of demands on it. There may be veterans that need paying, welfare payments for widows, the costs of resettling people. That may mean that a budget could easily spiral out of control, and so the government authorities will need loans or standby arrangements with the IMF, and will need to get donor money in quickly. The last point I would make is that there is an economic culture, or a culture of political economy, that preferences what many academics would call neoliberalism. In other words, a withdrawal of the state from economic functions such as production, even from infrastructure issues, and to diminish the role of the state in an economy and reduce it to kind of regulatory functions, much as we've seen in Western Europe, for example. So the sale of state assets may well be a feature of the conditions that are introduced to a post-conflict country.
Do you feel that this approach, these conditionalities, do you feel that the substance of these conditionalities have changed over the last 2 decades, or is it still Washington Consensus? And
I think there's been much more emphasis, at least in reports, if not in practice, on income generation for ordinary people, because it helps to reduce the size of the informal economy, because it means that there's likely to be more revenue for governments in the form of taxation, and because it means that families can survive more easily. And it also recognises that local communities will have initiatives of their own. They may have already developed these without any outside assistance. Indeed, they probably have in order to survive. There was a very, very good report, in my view, that came out a couple of years ago now from the UNDP. The report was very firm about capitalising on local initiatives. And to me this was very refreshing, because it suggested that there could be at least in theory, a movement away from top-down imposed, semi-imposed conditions and requirements to a much more locally based, meaningful sort of development than had previously been the case. But there are certain donors, for example, or certain international financial institutions that are still trying to introduce a kind of neoliberal development that can be very stressful for local communities. I noted that a couple of years ago now, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development had moved away from its exclusion of state-controlled activities and was now more willing to consider state-controlled activities or state-sponsored activities in the economy. And I thought that was at least some kind of move away from the neoliberal agenda that everything ought to be privatized if possible.